Good afternoon. Really quickly before we start, my name is Lisa Burgess from World Growth. Want to say thank you to all of you for attending today. World Growth is a sponsor of today's talks. Very proud to be one of the sponsors. We do have a trade and development program through our organization, so if there are any materials that you'd like to take a look at, please feel free to visit our website, worldgrowth.org. Speaking today is our chairman, Alan Oxley. He is the chairman of Australian Apex Study Centre, managing director of the leading public policy and trade consultancy group, ITS Global, in Melbourne, and as I mentioned previously, the chairman of World Growth. Joining him today is Tim Wilson. He is director of climate change policy and the IP and free trade unit. He's also senior fellow at New York Center for Medicine in the Public Interest, a board member of Allied Health, and serves on the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's IP industry consultative group. Excuse me. So without further ado, Tim and Alan, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Good afternoon. I'm sorry that we're responsible for you not having a leisurely lunch hour, but the conferences we run, we always think that conference time is precious. So if you're willing to have a little bit of indigestion while we address some of these questions, I'm very grateful for that. World Growth has a trade and environment program. I should explain that the philosophy driving World Growth is free markets, free trade, and in fact probably the inspiration for World Growth was a number of us observing the riots in Seattle way back in 1989, which was a grim point in international trade history. And at the time we wondered why all that happened and why in fact there weren't enough voices arguing for the benefits for growth and eradicating poverty of free trade. So a group of us got together a few years later and established World Growth. We are a fairly lonely voice in this area. We've also had a program on climate change and as I said before, we've been active on trade and environment issues. Today we wanted to address the question which does seem to be the one running through this discussion today, and that is how do you reconcile international trade arrangements with arrangements to manage the impact of climate change. We're going to actually argue a very simple proposition, and we think it's excessively ignored in the debate, but it provides a very key means to solve this supposed problem. It is that simply if the principles of free markets and open markets were respected by policymakers, both those trying to design measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and those who were addressing measures as to how we maintain and improve an open market trading system, if the principles of open markets and free markets were respected, then we wouldn't be having the dilemma that we face. In fact, I'm going to argue to you that the problem may be a lot easier to solve than you may think, because the reality that we face now in these climate change negotiations is that there will not be globally regulated caps on emissions. It's extremely unlikely that the Kyoto Protocol will have any more life breathed into it, and frankly, that's been the case for several years. The end of the Kyoto Protocol's life was really decided, in my opinion, at the UNFCCC meeting in Argentina several years ago, when it became clear the United States would not sign on, when it became clear that China would not agree to caps on emissions. And even at that point, Italy was indicating it did not agree with the EC position. And we know there's tension inside the community among some members. So the reality is that there will not be global agreements to limit emissions which will include a regulated cap. Now, what I want to do is, I've mentioned that as a reference point because it makes the discussion of the problem a fair bit easier, but even so, if the respect for the principles of the free market guided policymakers, some of the sorts of suggestions that have been made, for example, the idea, which I think is the worst of all, that there be some sort of plurilateral agreement or some exemption agreement in the WTO. This is an idea which came out of the Peterson Institute in Washington. I was very sorry to see that Gary Huffbauer put this together, that there be a sort of plurilateral agreement that any measure which had any impact on WTO obligations, which was a climate change measure, would be parked and special disciplines would apply. What I really couldn't understand about the logic of that is that for 30 to 40 years we struggled inside the WTO to get rid of exemptions, which severely harmed the capacity of the organisation and its rules to deliver benefits. I'm talking in particular about the rules on garments and textiles, and we still have not actually eradicated the problem caused by exemptions permitted to areas of agriculture. So why would we want to turn around and provide exemptions for an area conceivably of even wider impact across economies, which would be a set of regimes to regulate consumption of energy and consider that that wouldn't harm the multilateral trading system? So in this context, there's a couple of things to touch on. In respect of the climate change policies, the first one is what I call the urgency myth. In world growth, we have been consistently driven by looking at policies on climate change which will both be effective action to deal with the impact of increasing emissions, as well as not impeding the capacity of developing countries to grow. It's our belief that the reason that we've come to the sorry impasse that we now see in the UNFCCC is that the industrialised countries have consistently ignored the obligation which was laid down in the Rio agreements back in '91 and has been consistently expressed by developing countries since then, which is that if you're going to take any action to improve the environment in parallel, you must ensure those measures don't retard growth. And the leading measure which was going to retard growth in developing countries is the argument that developing countries should act quickly to cut emissions. This was propagated in the Stern report originally, but if you read the literature, you'll find that most development economists point out that nothing would harm the capacity of developing countries to grow than requiring them to take early action to cut emissions. Because there's no way that that can be done without retarding the ability of their economies to grow. And I frankly find it deplorable that the world's leading economies have continued down this path, believing that somehow or other there is no problem for developing countries. It's little wonder that China and India and Brazil and the others have done what they've done and are continuing to do it. The second thing about the climate change negotiations is what I call the impossible consensus. There is no basis for global agreement for regulated caps on emissions. And if you want to have a global agreement to address climate change, it can't be that. What it has to be is some sort of expansion of the framework which exists in the UNFCCC framework now. Now, I've mentioned the risk of exempting measures, which was suggested in the sort of Hufbauer consensus. And of course, that only arises from a very simple proposition. And it's that the industrialised countries who did want to impose binding national commitments to reduce emissions were simply unwilling to carry the cost. And one of the golden free market principles of the open economy, it goes right back to Adam Smith, is that the capacity of each economy to build its prosperity on the basis of its comparative advantage means that it does not pass the cost of any measures onto its trading partners. That's one of the golden rules which underpins the GATT and the free trade agreements. So if a country wishes to raise tax on some issue or other, higher corporate tax, higher income tax, it absorbs the cost. It does not put a trade barrier up to trade with import partners. And the same would apply with the carbon tax. So in this sense, if a country wishes to proceed to impose some sort of measure to reduce emissions inside its own economy, if it wishes to act as a civilised economy, if it wishes to respect the principles of open market, if it wishes to respect the right of national sovereignty, if it wishes to respect the capacity of countries to build prosperity from the comparative advantage, it will absorb its own costs. It won't put a tax on air travel. It won't impose discriminatory restrictions on imports of biofuel from developing countries. And I'm referring to the RED initiative in that respect. There's a lot of talk around the place that the first climate change measure has really been the EU's measure on airlines. It's not. The first measure is the Renewable Energy Directive, which now is likely to be contested by Canada, Indonesia, Malaysia, the United States, probably Brazil. Because if you look at that, that won't pass any of the standard tests about what's an acceptable regulatory trade barrier under WTO rules, and certainly is an exercise of discriminatory treatment of developing countries. So I think I've explained why it's essential to maintain the integrity of the WTO system, and in a sense the problem here comes back, which the question will be, well, what about the impact of the climate change measures? Now, in this respect, I also still come back to the question of our adhering to free market principles. Because the thing about the debate on climate change, which frankly has completely floored me, is that there's been so little discussion about the economic nature of the cap. We are frequently told that emissions trading is a market-friendly tool, and that therefore, under the arrangements that we've been talked about in the Kyoto Protocol and some of the other possibilities, is that we're respecting the market, we're using the market. Well, that's true, the market is being used, but the purpose for which the market has been used is something to which very little attention has been paid. It's being used to reduce the cost of a regulated cap on a key economic driver of any economy, that's energy costs. And what's the regulated cap? It's a command and control tool, straight out of the Soviet economic planning toolbook. And it just astounds me that we've had so little discussion around the place that a regulated cap is a good idea. So you might say to me, what's the alternative? The alternative is the same as if what we would, so we might use a tax in order to try to change behaviour. That's fine. You set the tax and measure whether it achieves the social objective sought. But you don't need to have a regulated cap, and nor should you. And if anything is a source of conflict between the principles of people trying to strike an arrangement to get a global management reduction of emissions of carbon tax, if there's a fundamental clash, it's between the idea of a regulated cap and the idea of open markets to free trade. If the principles of free market are aspired to, and we've written a brief paper on this in both areas, there is no problem. Thank you.
Well, it's always a hard act to follow on from Alan, at least because I don't think I'll be anywhere near as controversial. As introduced, my name's Tim Wilson. I'm the Director of Climate Change Policy in the IP and Free Trade Unit at the Institute of Public Affairs in Melbourne. And if anybody knows anything about the IPA, and I'm presuming in this audience you probably don't, the IPA is the world's oldest free market think tank, and so philosophically we're quite strongly aligned, obviously, with world growth. I just wanted to make some short and brief comments related to a discussion I think you've already been having throughout this conference on the issue of carbon tariffs. And actually before the Copenhagen conference I wrote a paper on carbon tariffs and their economic impact. Just to make sure there's no ambiguity about what I mean by carbon tariffs, because the difference between talking about a carbon tariff and a tax and emissions trading scheme can often seem interchangeable. I mean a border measure. Some sort of measure to reflect a domestic carbon price as a consequence of a domestic carbon price to protect industries or to avoid situations related to carbon leakage as a result of the cost imposition associated with an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax. And this is particularly relevant at the moment, obviously, because of the context in which Alan just outlined in the situation of the European Union and flights, which I understand you've also been discussing. But in the context of Australia, we've just introduced our own domestic carbon price through a direct carbon tax between now and 2015, and then moving to an emissions trading scheme come 2015 and thereafter, based on the idea that every other country will follow, and therefore there has already been discussions by key union groups about the need for a carbon tariff to protect particularly manufacturing sector, which is export orientated but has a very high energy input, which is also the source of our key sources of emissions. But of course these proposals didn't come out overnight. They've been flagged around the European Union, particularly France, for a long period of time. And there have also been big pushes in the United States to establish these types of measures. They've appeared in the Wax-Markey bill and will continue to, I'm sure, if there is any sort of domestic emissions trading scheme proposed in the United States, will continue to be included in any proposals precisely because of the influence of the union movement, but also because of the economic impact it can have in transferring industries overseas. The actual original design of the Australian emissions trading scheme before the current version, which has now been legislated, actually explicitly rejected the proposal on the back of economists who recommended that it was not a good way to protect industries against the consequences of a domestic carbon price. But of course is now still not included in the current scheme, but doesn't mean that it may not appear overnight. What we've seen, obviously, in the case of the EU as the start of next year is that there's going to be one imposed on flights. That's particularly controversial, obviously, because of potential flow-on effects it has and the issues about whether it's WTO consistent. I'd argue that despite the enthusiasm by some, particularly those who have a traditionally sympathetic position towards protectionism, that their legitimacy under international trade rules is actually quite questionable. The principle, as Alan outlined, of free trade is that countries should produce goods and services that take advantage of their comparative advantage. And these are actually a direct anathema to those principles, particularly when carbon-intensive energy production is a major source of comparative advantage for countries. Imposing a carbon tariff actually exacerbates the tension between also a carbon price signal and each country's capacity to exploit that comparative advantage as a consequence. But they're not just philosophically inconsistent with free trade, they're also likely to be legally inconsistent. In order to introduce carbon tariffs without the consequences of some sort of retaliatory measure or equivalent escalation from other countries, governments would need to design them to be consistent, of course, with their WTO obligations. And there's no accurate determination of WTO consistency with relation to whether these carbon tariffs may actually be legally accurate. We can go through a long discussion, but I think most of this audience will probably understand the different legal issues about whether it conforms to the situation of being a like product, and also whether you can impose a tax on process and production methods, and also whether, of course, it violates the principles of most favoured nation and also of national treatment. There's also, of course, issues around whether it can fit within the context of environmental exceptions, particularly under the GATT, such as Article 20G, which includes exemptions for those sorts of measures relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources if such measures are made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. However, whether man-made climate change actually fulfills that requirement is very much open to interpretation, particularly in terms of whether it also has the direct impact of actually achieving the policy objective that's outlined in the objective. So in terms of achieving WTO compliance, I think there are some serious issues about whether it would be achievable. The other thing that I think that's often always overlooked in terms of carbon tariffs is whether they're actually practically able to be implemented. Obviously, if you impose a direct tax at the border that reflects the price of a carbon price of a good if it's produced domestically, it would fulfil that objective. The problem is it's actually extremely hard to achieve. There are obviously a lot of rules of origins issues because, if you take an iPad as an example, which is obviously a very complicated piece of technology, the carbon price or the carbon footprint associated with an iPad is pretty much almost impossible to calculate at any given time and would fluctuate as a consequence, even if it was produced in even a single economy in itself. But there's also another problem related to the consequence of floating carbon prices. One of the things that I'm also trained in is actually as a carbon auditor. And one of the things you learn first if you're a carbon auditor is how you calculate the process of how you would apply a carbon tax or a carbon footprint for a particular product. For something like air flights, it's relatively straightforward because you actually take the distance, then multiply it by the mileage or consumption of fuel and the emissions produced over the distance of the flight of the plane. You then divide the plane within certain parameters based on the space used per individual. And so obviously in first class it's higher, business class it's less, and economy it's cheapest. And you then calculate and can apportion out the appropriate amount of carbon emissions and the carbon price attached to each of one of those seats. But for most products, it's actually much more complicated than that, particularly when you get down to much more micro levels of detail. If you chuck on top of that the fact that you have a carbon price which floats and goes up and down, it creates serious problems about how you're going to apply a border measure appropriate when you have a floating price. One of the standard rules about a tariff is, of course, it can't move on a very regular basis. And that is precisely what it would have to do if it was designed to reflect a domestic carbon price as a consequence of an emissions trading scheme, which, at least at this point, still seems to be the favoured mechanism by which you would try and impose some sort of carbon tariff. So I think it's extremely complicated and actually has serious issues about whether it's actually going to be viable in a construct as a consequence of any new international agreement or the extension of the Kyoto Protocol, particularly because of its focus on a floating carbon price and likely will be included in anything else. There's also issues, of course, about whether it will actually be effective in achieving its policy objective. They're unlikely to have the effect of prompting countries without a carbon price to signal to adopt a carbon price if that's one measure you wish to impose one for a policy objective, but also in terms of whether it will necessarily have a significant impact on those industries which may incur an extra cost, because a lot of carbon-intensive industries, and particularly I'm talking in the Australian context, comes directly from the electricity sector, is not mobile. So the consequence of leakage there is limited. It's only down the supply chain. So the question is, what is the effect on some of those industries? Yes, some of them will move, particularly, say, aluminium smeltering. But there are a lot of industries that will just cop the cost and won't actually do anything to necessarily reduce emissions. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Cut you off so that there could be some discussion. We haven't got much time. Questions, comments? Please. Is there a microphone? Coming from behind you.
Thanks very much. Aaron Cosby with ISD. A couple of excellent presentations. Just a quick question for each of you, actually. For Alan, I fully appreciate the idea that trade protectionism is harmful to growth, and I respect the objective of achieving more growth. But of course, there's been a great deal of work that contends that climate change physical impacts will also have an extremely deleterious effect on growth, and in particular in developing countries. So if we take that into account, I assume that your mathematics has to net out that effect. So in other words, if you're considering the validity or the value of something like the EU Renewable Energy Directive, for example, would you say, let's assume that the biofuel sustainability standard does achieve some climate change mitigation benefits. And if we assume that, then that directive will be beneficial for growth in as much as it mitigates climate change. Of course, it may also be deleterious for growth in as much as it obstructs free trade. So it's a cost-benefit analysis. Are you thinking of it in those terms? Do you net it out? And if so, what kind of results? At the end of the day, that requires a focus on the effectiveness of the policy, the environmental effectiveness of the policy at hand. And then a quick question for Alan, much quicker, or Tim. Alan basically proposed a tax, carbon tax, as a better solution than cap and trade. And we know that BTA is not only allowable, but widely used in the context of value-added taxes. So if I'm talking about a carbon tax nationally, does that change any of your opinions about the advisability, legality, practicability of a tax adjustment?
Okay, thanks. In respect to your two questions, is there damage to developing countries and does the RED directive have benefits? We're driven by assessment of the economics. And the debate among the economists is when can developing countries afford to meet the cost of mitigation? And this was I always thought the political aim of the Stern report. The Stern report said that unless they act quickly, then developing countries will have a bigger cost. There's a big debate about the cost of return that was calculated. And in fact, Stern is the nuclear, not in mainstream economists. The leading economist on this is Nordhaus for the United States, who always argued that before you ask developing countries to meet the cost of cutting emissions, you give them time to build their wealth. So Nordhaus' argument was always have a long, slow ramp. And in fact, the only case for acting quickly is political. There are no numbers endorsed in the IPCC which support the argument that there should be quick action. It was a political decision. In respect to the RED directive, yeah, it would be even better at reducing emissions if the EU didn't discriminate against cheaper biofuels coming in from Brazil, Indonesia and Malaysia. And the RED directive is discriminatory because if you look at it, it's a classical EU agricultural barrier. I'm sure the measure was calculated to ensure that the European rape producers could supply whatever biofuel they could from their sources, and the rest of the market was left open for who could be supplied from cheaper sources. The RED directive. Well, is the RED directive effective? I mean, we come back then to the question of whether it actually is a practicable way of reducing emissions. I mean, what always slayed me about the RED directive is it was vigorously opposed initially by WWF and Greenpeace. And what was their reason? Because their argument was that the only legitimate way to reduce emissions in Europe was to put the screws on the carbon industries. And they actually took a political position that cheaper forms of assistance of reductions, which not only would include biofuels from cheap sources, they also excluded using sustainable forest management. Only recently has WWF changed its position on that. But if you go into the IPCC report on forestry, the chapter on forestry says right at the beginning the most effective way and cheapest way to reduce emissions is expanding sustainable forest management. And that's not the position being run by those green NGOs.
I'll just keep my comments extremely short. I think what a direct VAT would do would resolve particularly the issues related to a floating price. There's no ambiguity in my mind that if you actually had a straightforward tax which was simply applied, you would actually get a much higher degree of compliance with the WTO. But the problem is, of course, that we have a floating price, therefore you get the complications. It wouldn't resolve a lot of the rules of origins issues that may arise because of the tax needing to reflect the components that are produced within the country, but also the components that aren't produced in the country and the consequences of the emissions associated with how much is necessary per footprint for the component and the process.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you. I think it was quite some provocative, and so your intervention, and so you hopefully understand that I perhaps also a little bit provocative in my remarks and comments. First of all, I feel CPA is not really the only approach to estimate whether it's justified or not. It is unfortunate that the benefits of mitigation go over so long time, over many decades, that the current instruments available are not really appropriate at all. It doesn't work. And this is reflected in the discussion on the discount rates. And there is no science to define what an appropriate discount rate is. It is simply a value judgment. And on the IPCC, if you would have insights how the IPCC reports have been elaborated, the scientists were very clear that the social costs of carbon are higher now already compared to the mitigation costs. And it was only due to less of scientific rigor that did not allow such conclusion to make it to the end. And the fifth assessment report will properly provide such insights, because the studies will be based on more similar basis of accounting. And I fully support that in order to assess the justification of an approach, only, if you can provide an approach that is more efficient, more effective, that's a matter of debate. But if you can't, I feel it would be unjustified, given the complexity of climate change impacts, to take any such measure into question.
My comment on that is that that's a long, wide, legitimate area for discussion and debate. But given the world in which we live, any measure to propose global action to reduce emissions, which does not win the support of all the major economies, is futile, no matter how much scientific work is done. And that's actually the key problem here. In my opinion, the IPCC work has been misused by those wanting to see some form of global regulation without taking into account the interests of those upon whom the effect might be the greatest. Now, this is a simple point of political reality. Until we actually work out an approach to climate change where all major economies will contribute, then all the discussion in the world about the science actually gets us nowhere except maybe helping us to understand better the issue. And quite frankly, there's an awful lot more work to be done in that respect as well. The back, yep.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'll shout. The question is on to you, Alan. I must say, firstly, thank you for bringing us to a more realistic paradigm that there is no likelihood that we'll be having another commitment along the lines of Kyoto Protocol. You said something like countries that imposed some punitive measures to moderate or to reduce greenhouse gases within their countries should not pass over the burden to their trading partners. So I just wanted further clarity on how do you monitor that in a free market economy without adding some further administrative burdens to the government. Just clarity, because I'm not sure how really the government will be doing that, because it's going to be a trade between companies, you know, their international counterparts. I just want to know how the government can intervene in a more kind of a fair manner.
I guess I'm looking at this, frankly, from within the framework of existing arrangements. And when I make the point that, respecting free market principles, a country won't pass the costs to another, what I'm referring to is the use of trade measures. And I'm not actually referring to any others, but this discussion here is evidently around the trade measures because that's what's been the subject of attention. And I think, frankly, the current WTO rules and the way in which they've been interpreted and recent interpretations of how environmental regulations should be permitted or not permitted under the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement themselves provide a very effective way of monitoring compliance with that.
Thank you. I have a question for either or both of you. Thank you. I have a question for either or both of you. And it starts with an assumption or recognition. We have two quite different approaches to economics. We'll call it the free trade approach, and the other one is the environmental economic approach. Trade economics is mostly based on an assumption that free trade is a good thing, it leads to efficiency, and that government interventions are a problem. Environmental economics, on the other hand, tends to start with a recognition that there are certain kinds of market failures. And in the case of climate change, there are the market failures that contribute to the problem, the externalities and the use of fossil fuels. There are also market failures in the adoption of solutions, particularly large-scale investments in new technologies. So we have these two quite different sort of approaches to the roles of markets and governments. And so when we get to specific issues like subsidies for wind or subsidies for solar, we tend to get two really quite diametrically opposed diagnoses. So what I'm looking for is a way out of this. And I'm wondering if either of you have any ideas about how the world could begin to resolve these two conflicting approaches.
Well, I'll start by making a comment that generally what I find increasingly what people refer to as market failures is outcomes that they don't like, which aren't necessarily what is. But I'm going to say it with that comment and say, but I do understand your point, and I'm not sort of broadly disputing it, but. Basically, countries have a right to pursue their own public policy objectives as they see fit, and that is well enshrined in so long as it doesn't unnecessarily distort trade, etc. If we're looking in the WTO context, and they're more within their right to pursue their comparative advantage in that context. And if they wish to try and alter that and tax themselves or regulate themselves into prosperity, then well, good luck to them. There are plenty of countries that have tried to do that and spectacularly failed over the time. But I don't think, ultimately I'm a free trader because it actually it encourages and fosters the most efficient use of the world's scarce resources. So you put the lowest input for the maximum output in a very basic way. And this is about actually redesigning that and actually trying to use more resources to produce less, which actually isn't necessarily environmentally or economically beneficial. And I'm generally quite wary of environmental economics which tries to achieve that objective precisely for that reason. So I think the impasse to it is actually to continue to pursue the basic theory of comparative advantage and free trade as a consequence. And everything else is just public policy because governments decide they want to pursue some other agenda and they'll pay the consequences for it in the process.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I do think it's the generalities appear to make the case, but I think when it comes to the practicalities, it's sort of useful. I think one of the most egregious abuses of this concept has recently been visited upon us in the last few years by the World Bank, who've argued that in forestry, the major problem is that payment for environmental services where there are large forests in developing countries aren't made, and that somehow or other you've got to create a market to provide that. Now, of course, that market doesn't actually exist. And why doesn't the market exist? Well, because the people inside that economy concerned have got other preoccupations. Now, as a matter of public policy, the government wishes to protect forests, that's its business. It's quite a legitimate way to go about that. But to build a construct, as the World Bank has done, which has actually led to all these REDD programs, and they're going to be a very sorry set of activities by the time we get to the end of all that. I think it's actually helped serve to mislead addressing quite legitimate problems when there are much more standard ways in which we can address them.
Yes. Hello. I'm Ricardo Melendez from ICTSD. I missed the main presentation, so I'm handicapped to comment on that. But just on the question that Thomas Brewer just asked, and following the response of Tim Wilson, just very simply, Tim, what you're saying is that you don't believe that there are market failures, or that if there are market failures, then we shouldn't do anything about them. Is that it?
No, I didn't say that. Well, what I said was I think there are plenty of examples where people complain about market failure, and it normally means they're complaining about an outcome that they don't desire. I'm not saying there are market design issues, and part of the challenge and what we're debating here is, not necessarily here, but across the road, is whether carbon should be priced on an international level or carbon dioxide and equivalent greenhouse gases should be priced, and whether that's a market design issue, and that's what a lot of countries are going through and what we've just gone through, and they've made a domestic decision about that. But I agree wholeheartedly with Alan, unless you actually have some sort of recognition of a measure which is accepted by the major industrialised economies, it's frivolous and pointless, and so you can actually just create a rod for your own back in the process, as we have done in our country by introducing some sort of a carbon price when the rest of the world, or the rest of the major industrialised economies aren't doing the same thing.
Well, so again, my question is, and I think it's Thomas' question as well, so what do we do? It's not just what others are saying and what you don't agree. What do we do?
What do you mean? What do we do in terms of trade, or what do we do in terms of domestic carbon prices?
You're saying don't use trade?
Sorry?
You're saying don't use trade. So
well, I don't think
on trade you say just continue using a comparative advantage theory and dismiss the notion that there will be market failures.
Absolutely, because I don't see how you're going to get any beneficial environmental outcome from ditching comparative advantage and free trade in the process. What you're actually just going to do is see more of the world's scarce resources used to produce less, which has a whole series of economic, environmental and political concerns as a consequence. In our domestic context, we've imposed a carbon price which, if it's had the environmental effect that it's desired, will need to go up in the many hundreds of dollars to change the way that we're using our major electricity generation to move towards renewables or gas technology. That is politically unsustainable in the context unless there's some sort of international agreement amongst industrialised economies on how to cut their emissions.
Yes, David Laborde from IFPRI. I am a trade economist. I believe in markets, but I think that we are dealing here with problem of public goods and missing markets, and we cannot avoid the fact that if the US produce CO2 that impact climate change, it shifts the comparative advantages of other economies. It creates an externalities. If you look at the evolution potentially of climate change in the Caribbean, the tourism industry of small islands in the Caribbean is impacted by the production and the consumption pattern of other countries. So we are dealing here with a serious problem of negative externalities. all market economies should accept this, and we need to find a solution. So I now totally agree with you that starting to propose things that will not be supported by India, China, or Brazil doesn't make any sense. We are losing our time. So with this point, I agree. But now the question that I be asked, what we can do? Or we do nothing, and it will not solve the problem, or we accept the fact that if we don't find a cooperative solution on the short term, we need to go to non-cooperative behavior. Tit-for-tat things. I hurt you, you hurt me, but at one point we find an agreement. We have seen it between the US and the EU on the agriculture during 20 years. Then the Blair House Agreement, because the two big players have said, we went too far. We need to find an agreement. So what is the situation, and what you think can be the way to bring, maybe not the cooperation on the short term, but it's not the case that the US and the EU have to start to play non-cooperatively to bring on the table of negotiation the other big players. So what do you think about this? Now my other question is, we talk about border tax, but maybe as in agriculture, the most serious problem will be subsidies, and where we are going to start to see regulation on subsidies. And maybe the bridge between two, because if we don't go for a border tax in the EU, and if we don't want more subsidies on green energy, for instance, do you think that the US or the EU should start to be much more offensive in terms of fossil fuel subsidies in emerging economies? Because it's a major source of distortion right now, and major source of carbon. Obviously, there is also a reduction of the cost of production in some of the emerging economies. It's a source of distortion on competitiveness of industries, and maybe there is a solution at the WTO to get conflict on this.
I think you have to be practical about what sort of world we live in. And we don't live in a world where either the United States or the European community can dictate to the rest of the world what it wants to do in these sorts of areas. We don't have world government, mercifully. So the reality, which is the point I made before, is that whatever we do has got to be within the bounds of what's feasible. You mightn't like the result, but that's the reality. And if we don't accept that as a basic reality, we're going to find ourselves driven down one-way streets like the one we're in right now. 20 years there have been negotiations on climate change, and they've actually gone backwards. The Kyoto Protocol is about to be allowed to lapse. The United States now has said it won't sign a replacement, whereas at least the Clinton-Gore administration said they'd sign the Kyoto Protocol, in full knowledge that Congress would never agree to it. So do you propose we run down that path? I mean, it's the point I made before, is that if you have to accept the realities, now you may not like the way it's running, you may say that the tourist industry in Barbados is being damaged, and I'd like to know how you measure that. But the reality is that we need to construct solutions within the framework of what's achievable and doable. And what we must not do is continue to hunt down solutions which are actually going to have very considerable harm and damage. And I must say, in the whole debate, the casual dismissal of the position of the developing countries has always amazed me. When the negotiations on the Kyoto Protocol started, and European environmental negotiators used to say, oh, don't worry, we'll lead, others will follow us. Well, I've been involved in multilateral negotiations for a long time, even before I was involved in WTO. And I don't know where on earth the European environmentalists thought that the example they were going to set would be followed in Brazil, in India and China. And those countries, they've been playing games. There's gaming going on now. It's gaming when they say we want to keep the Kyoto Protocol. They're only saying that because they don't want to be exposed to the possibility of taking on commitments, which they're not going to do anyway. But the gaming is no less deplorable than the gaming on the industrialised side of the camp. And the question I put is this: if you think the risk for the whole thing is so terrible, doesn't it strike you as odd that the leaderships in China and Brazil, if they thought it was so horrible too, might be actually concerned about the welfare of people? These are countries which have suffered natural calamities much greater than most industrialised countries. And I'd have to say, you need to actually accept that they maybe don't think it's quite as grim as is being put, and they certainly don't think so, or they'd be taking some action. So if we've got a global problem here, we've got to find a solution which works and which will have a global solution. And to suggest that one major power or another chase off and run people down and take action, the consequences of that for destroying not only just the structure and framework of the World Trade Organisation, but the common civility and the way in which we conduct international relations is very serious indeed.
Just on the second part of your question, I don't think I fully appreciate and understood it, but you were talking about subsidies, and I think you're talking about whether there should be pathways to take action on subsidies, if that's correct.
Yes, I was thinking that about subsidies. There's two parts. One about subsidies for the, let's say, green technology, and we are going, and we already see countries putting more money there with the problem of local content. So it can be a big field for WTO case to do. But we have also the problem today where we have subsidies for the fossil fuel. And
For
the fossil fuel.
Fossil fuels.
energy.
Oh, right.
That are not going yet at the WTO. It can be a way to use the WTO to try to get fair competition. And
Well,
at
the
same time-
objective isn't to achieve fair competition. The objective is to achieve fair trade. But in terms of
both.
Well,
If
well,
you
that-
look at the text of the WTO, you have both.
The point about subsidies is, I mean, well, ultimately it comes down to whether they're WTO compliant or not. And what we've actually seen continuously is a debate about whether, and there was something that came out of the recent APEC leaders meeting about providing and removing tariff barriers or trade barriers, which created problems with relation to international trade in green technology. And you know, we've had this debate many times before about what is a green technology, and what countries do is retreat to what's in their economic interests. So biofuels are often called a green technology by Brazil because they want market access in certain economies for their green technologies. And so that is a form of a green technology, and of course developed countries want to focus mostly on industrialised goods, which are green technologies because it advance their economic interests. There are already standard rules set out about what you can subsidise and what you can't. But this really takes back to the point of the first question, which is we actually know what will solve the problem of trying to cut emissions, and it's cheap, affordable technology. And one of the best ways to achieve that is to make sure that we have strong intellectual property rights protection, which enables innovation and licensing, but also to promote trade, because by promoting trade you actually promote technology transfer and also access to cheaper inputs to actually create these types of technologies. And that's not given enough credence or focus in this debate. Instead, we're focusing too much on how to restrict and protect domestic markets as a consequence of imposing domestic carbon prices.
Okay. Time for one more question, and then we'll close up. Yes, another go.
I would like to make two comments. First, I feel it's not so much the barriers in the countries, but it's the main barriers in some parts of the fossil fuel industry which drive those countries. My second point is that I feel it will very soon become a non-issue at all, because renewables will be economically competitive with the fossil fuels. There's already now the case in Brazil that a wind park is more economic viable compared to using natural gas. And if you take that, I feel it's really a pity that some industrialized countries leave the market as well as the competitive industry to China. I think that's the real challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. Won't make any comment on that. I don't disagree with much of that. Thank you very much for your time. We were described as provocative, yes, but I must say over time we've found this debate frankly frustrating for the elements of the things that should be discussed which should not be discussed, and we think that actually has helped impede getting practicable solutions. So good luck with the rest of your session. Thank you very much.